So, one thing we're not going to do today is try to sell books. So no one here is going to try to sell a book. What we're trying to do is to have writers talk about the experience of writing. And mostly we're going to focus on writing books. But I want to mention, just if I go down the list here, Alex, who has written his first and now his second murder mystery at this advanced age, but he spent an incredible life as a journalist, extraordinary stuff, including actually being wounded on the battlefield in Somalia. I mean, these people have really interesting lives that they have led besides what I'm going to be asking about. Bill Littlefield, as you know, an incredible career in broadcast journalism, in NPR, in sports, forever. And yet he's written two novels that I think are just extraordinary novels I'm really impressed with, and I hope that he'll talk about that. Al is our Renaissance man. I think there's not a medium of artistic creation that hasn't taken part in yet, although I haven't seen any of your origami. Have you done it?
Nothing visual.
Music, writing, poetry, extraordinary stuff, and he's been an enormous help. Jack McLean, I think, the best-selling author here we've got. Jack, obviously a Marine in Vietnam, and wrote his first book, Moon, about his experiences there and the aftermath of coming back. It's an amazing book, and his second book, Found, is, I think, equally amazing. So Jack has got that experience. I had the pleasure of getting to read some of Jack's book while it was still in manuscript, telling her he should put a comma and things like that. I was very
I did.
I was incredibly helpful to him. Eric Best was a journalist as well for many, many, many years before I think he went to Wall Street then and corrupted yourself there. And he wrote a book about his sailing his own boat, solo sailboat, from San Francisco to Hawaii and back. And it's called Into My Father's Wake. And probably half of you in the room, I've given copies of this book to. It is just an amazing book. And I hope Eric will talk about being that kind of a writer, as well as having spent a large career in journalism. Lucy she like me, she's a lawyer, she commits law, and she happens to have been a federal prosecutor in the Maine Department of Justice back in the day. She was a trial lawyer, did some incredible things, and now as part of the overall legal profession, among her other things that she is foremost expert on for the American Bar Association is artificial intelligence, AI, and she's got several books, including about AI, and I told her, but we're not going to talk about AI today, not because it's not important, it's incredibly important, it's because the writing experience of the books we're talking about here were written by our classmates before AI was a factor. So it's that frame of mind and experience that I'm hoping we're going to get. Ray is probably the most prolific person we've got who's on the panel, with the possible exception of Bill. Bill's been incredibly prolific too. Ray has written, our class notes forever, so you've all read Ray's prose. Ray also is one of the few people in our class, I think, who went into academia teaching, and has done a great job teaching the things that we were taught here. Of course, his life, and he's written an amazing variety of things, including novels, some of which he's trying to get published right now. Mike Tansey had also an extraordinary career, including in government. Has written, I don't know how many different things, a really long list. But it's the diaries I hope he's going to talk about today, because I think that's unique. There's no one else here who's a diarist, so that's so. What I wanted to start was just a question. You could go down the row, but then I think it would be nice to get a discussion among you on some subsequent questions. But thinking about a book that you sat down to write, with the idea of writing it to be published, when did you do it? When did you first sit down to write a book you intended to be published? What impelled you or propelled you to do it, compelled you to do it? And what was the experience like? And we go down the road, we'll do that. Mike, you just have to talk about the diaries. And then we'll come back to some more general questions about the process.
So I spent 40 years of my life writing news stories for broadcast. So the longest thing I ever wrote was 4 minutes long. And when I tried to write something for print, I'd stop at about 10 pages. That was it. I was tapped out. But in retirement, I reverted to an interest in a hobby that I had, and like probably many of us at our age, and that was model railroads.
Oh, yeah.
And I had a layout as a kid, and I said, I'm going to have one now I'm in retirement. I can make it really fine. And I got involved with a local division of the National Association, and ended up being the editor of their newsletter. And so I regularly write and print articles about model trains. And about 2 years ago, the thought came to me, could you write a novel involving model trains? And if you think about it, it's...
Could you engineer a novel about that?
But I struggled with this, and then I finally had an idea that it would work. If I threw in the theft of the single most expensive brass locomotive ever made, a Chinese espionage scheme, and I sat down and just wrote. And it took me about 6 months, and the book came out last December. And at that point, I already had a sequel in mind, and that came out last month. And I've got a third one in mind, and they're now a thriller series involving two main characters, one of whom is conveniently an NIH virologist, and his girlfriend, now fiance, who is an investigative reporter for the New York Times. And somehow the doctor went to college, the same one I did, and the journalist went to the same one my wife Pat went to. So, you draw a little bit from life. But
Tell me about the experience of writing.
the experience, I've always enjoyed writing, so it hasn't been, I know so many people struggle with writing. But I just sat down and wrote. And it flowed, and it required some massaging, and I got some great tips after the first one came out from my wife's book club. They had an in to get them to read the first book. I got some very valuable suggestions that went into the sequel. So, as far as the nature of writing, I'm having fun. And I don't pretend that this is going to be a literary breakthrough. It's an enjoyable experience for me and for my friends and family and a lot of people who are out there buying. As I mentioned to Rick yesterday, I got an email that I had received a royalty of $2.38 from Apple because somebody bought my ebook on there.
I assume it was your wife's book club. The ideas for the sex scenes for the next novel. Bill, you've been writing obviously your whole adult life, and you don't have to just talk about these two novels, but tell us a little about sitting down and deciding to write a book.
The first time that happened, I had been teaching at Curry College for some years, and I helped organize a teachers union there. They never had one, they never had a contract, nobody ever had a sabbatical. There was no process for grievances. It was horseshit. And so we put a union together. It took 5 years, and I presided over negotiating 2 contracts, and I thought that was a pretty good story. So I sat down to write a novel that would take place on a small college campus, and it would basically be the guts of it would be the experience that I had had. And I wrote it over the course of a fairly long time. And it was pretty much garbage. It'll never be published. But it taught me that I could write a novel. It taught me that I was capable of writing 300 and some pages of fiction. So that was a pretty important experience.
This is a point that I have made ever since I wrote a novel, which is you should write a novel. If it's, forget whether it's going to be published or not, everybody should write a novel. The process of writing a novel, it sure teaches you a lot about novels and how to read novels. It's a really interesting thing.
I can't really agree.
That's just because you're wrong.
It brings to mind a story about a friend of mine. Some of you may be familiar with a writer named W.C. Hines, Bill Hines. He was a newspaper writer, wrote for the Old New York Sun, and then decided that he would write magazine pieces, basically one of the very early guys who used the sort of Tom Wolfe strategy of magazine piece writing. And then eventually wrote a wonderful book called The Professional, which Ernest Hemingway said was the only good novel he'd ever read set in boxing and a damn good first novel in its own right. That's a quote from the back of the novel. Bill also co-wrote the novel MASH that the TV and movies were all based on eventually, because a surgeon came back from Korea and said, I got some great stories, and he went to an editor, and the editor said, yeah, you got some great stories, but you can't write a lick, and introduced him to Bill Hines, and together they produced that novel. But anyway, after he had written The Professional, which took him a year, Bill was walking down the street in New York one day, and he ran into a friend who hadn't seen him in a while. And the friend said, Jesus Christ, Bill, you look like hell. Are you sick? What's the matter? And Bill said, this is what you look like when you spend a year trying to write better than you can write.
That's a great tale. Okay, Al.
Well, when I was at Brown, I was trained to write novels. I mean, I was a fiction writer. I was writing a little bit of poetry. I was doing a lot of music. I was writing musical shows, but I was writing book and lyrics. So I was always involved with writing. But long-form writing, fiction, was something that I was trained to do by my mentor, R.V. Castle, who had just come to Brown from the Arrow Writers Workshop. And there's a method that prospered at the Iowa Writers Workshop that he brought with him to Brown. And that's what I was trained to do. And so I wrote one novel as an undergraduate, and then I was also there later in the grad school. So I wrote my second novel, and then I went on the road with a blues band and didn't write anything for a few years. And then when I got back from that, I started teaching in an independent private school in East Providence, Rhode Island, Providence Country Day School. And I could not work on a long form. I couldn't write a novel. So I shifted into short forms. And by then I was writing songs and poetry. So my books are poetry collections. And so you could argue that what I really did was, there are 100 poems each book. So you could say, well, okay, I wrote 100 separate installments. I didn't really write a book. I made a collection. But I do have the two novels that I wrote according to the way I was trained. And mercifully, my first novel, in fact, and I just had occasion to talk with Frank Klein about this. And when you see the video that we put together, Fran reads a couple of poems of his about Bill Haviland. And anyway, I was talking with Fran, and I told him that there was a character in my first unpublished novel based on him. And there were some episodes that actually happened in the dorms. And lucky for me, I had an agent that was shopping it around, and he got to Doubleday, and they were kind of interested. And they said, well, aren't you already at work on a second novel? And I said, yeah. They said, well, okay, why don't you show us that when it's done? So, again, blessedly, the first one went into the waters of oblivion where it needed to go. Because I agree with Rick, everybody should write a novel. But
And then throw it away.
But then if you really want to write novels, start another one right away. So then my second one, I wasn't all that thrilled with. And then I went on the road, so the whole thing became moot. But basically, the creative process is what I was taught And I still use the same basic creative process, whether I'm writing a poem or a song or a play. And those are all things that I do on an ongoing basis.
And that's coming back to my second question, so I'm gonna lead you on the process.
Got it.
Because Al and I have talked about this, it's his views of it are very interesting, and anyway, I think it's, we'll come back to it.
Sure.
But Jack, we sort of know what prompted you to write a book. You were in Foxville, but tell us about actually writing it. Besides, I mean, what you had to come back and actually write. So, and you didn't write right away either. So tell us about that.
Everybody has a story. Everybody. And I had one in there. Rick triggered us in this process by asking us what English teachers we might have had at Phillips Academy that triggered us or that were important to us. And in my case, none the first year, none the second, none the third. The fourth, which was by that time my upper year, I had the great good fortune, like many of you, to sit in a room with dozen fits for a year. And I don't think that, I can't quite remember what I learned from Dudley Fitz, but I learned that I was valuable, for lack of a better word, that I could in fact express myself, not in a great way, not better than Rick, but and then the next year, my senior year, a funny thing happened. I'm probably the only person here who would ever say that the teacher that had a great impact on him as any was Dalton McBee. I will say they were in the same class. And McBee was, he was no Dudley Fitz, but he was a calm, settling thing, and I think he took the confidence that I had somehow innately gained the previous year and encouraged me and was positive about what I wrote. We didn't write much, was positive about what I wrote, which gave me the confidence to write, to just put words on paper without being embarrassed. Several months later, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in the spring of 1966. Went down to Paris Island on the first day, wrote a brief note to my parents to tell them I was there. Several days later, I wrote a longer letter telling them what it was like. And over the next 2 years, wrote 110 letters home. Just, hi, here I am, here's a picture of my fox. I mean, just, most of my buddies wrote home things like, this sucks and it sucks, But I just was really trying to describe for their benefit, not because I thought I could write. My mother saved them all. They went in the shoebox. Years went by, and two things happened. My parents died, as happens, and I became increasingly disturbed for reasons I couldn't understand. And having been happily married for 20 years, the marriage falls apart. Having had 3 daughters, that relationship started to fall apart. Having been successfully employed for many years, I started getting fired from jobs, 1, 2, 3. And then, as I described it, my wheels fell off. And I was betwixt and between, and my then wife found the box of letters and was about to throw them out and said, what's this? And I said, oh, they're the letters I wrote home when I was in the Marine Corps. And she said, what are you going to do with them? I said, and my mother always thought I should write like a book or something. And she said, why don't you? I was unemployed, I was in the dumps. And so I sat down and started to transcribe the first letter.
Jack, can I interrupt you just for a minute? How much time between coming back from Vietnam and sitting down to do that?
35 years. During that time, having had no contact with anybody that I'd been to Vietnam with, which was not uncommon for Vietnam vets. None. And we had been in a battle after which the first book is named, which 40 of us were killed within 2 days. This being the second day, June 6th, 16 years ago today. And another 100 of us were wounded, some very, very severely. And it built. I didn't know what it was. Nobody knew what PTSD was. I had lupus, I had diabetes, I had other things that I just thought were part of growing up. I had no idea that they might be connected to my heavy exposure to Agent Orange since I had cancer. But I just started writing, and I didn't write to write a book. I wrote to, I guess, get it on paper for my own therapy, and I thought maybe in the end I'd have a sort of a what did Daddy do during the war book for my three lovely daughters. And after 5 years of writing, including the time that Rick mentioned that we were together, probably at Toppers, and I told him that I was sort of thinking of doing this, and he said, you want me to read it? And I thought, well, no, that's too personal. Yeah, I didn't really want anybody to read it. But Rick did, and he did come back with comments, and there are many of you in this room who followed this course as it went on and were loving, and we started in the day I got back from Vietnam, and a week later started at Harvard, and I got under the wing of Jack, Chris, Rich, and Skip, who were all in a very cold sort of time in the country's life, and in that for Vietnam veterans, they really embraced me and said, okay, what the fuck, you're back. I said, what do I take for history? He said, well, you take this, you take that, and don't do this, and don't do that. I said, okay. Fabiani had been there, and Franco. It's just, I could look over my whole support group. So much of it was in this room. And increasingly, thanks to the internet, I found the guys that I'd served with. And increasingly more of the guys I'd served with. And we started to realize that what had happened had really, in fact, happened. And like Rick, they sort of said, can I take a look? And they take a look and said, this is really important. You have to, this is really important. It's important for us. This is important. You're telling our story. And I also realized that something that I always thought about was the time that I graduated, or the time that I arrived at Paris Island, I knew that I was having an experience that nobody in this room was having. And we'd all been together sharing this thing for those years, and now all of a sudden I was here, and I was in a totally different, unique place. And I thought there must be some way that I could tell all of you what it was like for me in a language that you might understand without the sound of an axe grinding in the background. Nothing wrong with just talking about it. And I tried to, through friends and supporters, I found one agent, and that didn't work, found somebody else that might do it, and
He was no good for me either, I want you to know.
or he for me, I went for the second one. And I was through much to my, at this point I'm unemployed, I've been unemployed for a while, I've been writing. I'm living now, I'm divorced for the second time, I'm living over a garage in the Outer Banks, over my friend Terry Tillery, who was our radio man in Vietnam. I'm upstairs in the garage, below is the Corvette and the Harley, like any ex-Marine. And he was he was guru or something, but Terry, I always tell people that Terry was cursed with a near perfect memory of everything that happened during that time. And I always wondered how he was able to sleep at night. But we constructed it. The guy who picked up was very, very fortunate to find an agent in New York. I found myself flying up from Washington to New York to meet her for the first time at Sterling Militaristic. And I'm going to the Louis Sullivan building on Bleecker Street. And I'm standing outside with my little folder, wearing my blue suit, And I'm about to walk in. I said, I could be Ferlinghetti, I could be Dylan. I'm sitting here with like an original thing that nobody knows about, that nobody's seen, and inside there, is, the amplifier. And
We're going to get to publishing. Can I go on?
Yeah, that was the, but the story, emerged over those times. I think that's the writing of it. But I certainly did not sit down to write a book that anybody would read. It was not my task.
Well, Eric, that's a hard act to follow.
Yeah.
But go ahead, you got to follow it. Good job.
Yeah. Yeah, I had really mixed feelings about coming and doing this for reasons that I'm still trying to work out exactly. But first I want to say that Al did a beautiful job with the videos, and one of the things he did was he concluded with something about his own poetry, having talked about somebody who taught him to try to let the unconscious come out and then work, having let it out, then try to work with it and figure out what it is. And he ended with saying, I think this is the end of his sonnet, in which he said, I make a space for it, and it appears. And I thought, okay, so Rick has made a space for this, and so what is going to appear exactly? And a tough act to follow is one thing that's appeared. And the second is, with all there is to say, what is it that's really valuable at this point? And I find myself, feverishly taking notes, thinking about what is my story in response to Rick's question. So I had made it as a journalist as far as the San Francisco Examiner. I had bought a sailboat that I was living on in San Francisco. I was divorced for the first time. I was struggling with, what's wrong with me? Where is all this going? I went to see an old guy, guru guy in San Francisco named Joe Miller, who used to take people on walks through Golden Gate Park, as they tried to figure out, the answer to their question. And I went to see him, and he turned out to be this unbelievably rare guy who listened so powerfully, like with his chest, that it made you say things you hadn't really thought of. And at one point he said to me, look, you're a smart, educated guy. If you came to you with what's in you now, what would you say? And without even thinking, I said, well, I would tell myself to try to live closer to my heart and walk in the path of my fear. And he looked at me and said, oh, that's interesting. I understand the first part. What do you mean by the second part? And I said, well, I think that I've come to this point afraid to be alone. And I made decisions because I was afraid to be alone. I didn't go there because I was afraid to be alone, or I stayed there because I was afraid to be alone. I always said, Joe Miller, thank you very much for coming today, which is what gurus say to you when you've got the answer to the question you came with. And I still remember walking down the stairs of his place on whatever that hill is in San Francisco, and writing in my notebook, oh, I know, I'm gonna sail to Hawaii. Because if I sail to Hawaii by myself, I'll fix myself. I won't be afraid of being alone anymore. So that's why I set out and I made a deal with the Examiner. I'll sail to Hawaii, I'll write a story about it, I'll find a business story while I'm in Hawaii, I'll write that, and then I'll sail back and then I'll be vacation. And they said, okay, that's a deal. We pissed everybody off. I found out later that at least half the dudes were hating my guts because I somehow sold that to management. Anyway, so I went through the experience taking notes as I always had, just writing stuff, what happened today, and so on. I got back to the Examiner and I quit. They had, I think I had $20,000 to spend living for a year, and I went north of San Francisco, and I just sat down to really start with the first journal and write through it and tell the story of, what was it like sailing alone? It turned out, a lot of people would ask that question, what was it like? What was it like? And the honest answer was, it's not like anything. Like, you really have to kind of be there and realize, wait, I'm in 4 million square miles of water. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to get run down randomly by a passing freighter, although it turns out, yes, you can. Anyway, what I learned was, no, I wasn't actually alone. Everyone that had ever affected or influenced me was with me, in me, and would appear in certain ways, unexpectedly, and that became part of the story. So when I sat down to write it, I thought, okay, I'm going to write a 3-strand book. It's going to be sailing along Hawaii. It's going to be growing up in the New England family I did with the father that I had, who was challenging, and the relationships of the women in my life. So I wrote this 3-strand thing. I finished it in about a year. I sent it off to this quite famous agent named Candida Donadio, who was like Mario Puzo's agent. I still remember she called me. I picked up the phone in, I can't remember now the time. Anyway, I picked up the phone. She said, "Is this Sarah Pesca?" She said, "This is Candida Donadio, and if you want me, I want you." Mm-hmm. And I burst into tears, thinking, that's it. I made it. Yeah, well, Heather Donadio, as it turned out, would grow very ill and sick and die, and be replaced by an agent who really didn't like my book that much. And then I got another agent who really didn't like the strand about women. And because I had run out of money, I went looking for a job with somebody who I had interviewed once for USA Today, this guy Peter Schwartz, who started a company in Emeryville called Global Business Network, which was a consultancy built around the idea of creating stories about the future and then informing strategy in the present. So, I needed money, I took the job, I went there, I learned how to do it. 5 years later, some guys walked in from Morgan Stanley and said, we want somebody to help us think about what the future of the internet means for financial services, which in 1995 was a really smart question and a good way to ask it. So by then, my father had died, my older brother had had a terrible crippling accident, my mother was getting Alzheimer's, and I was given an offer to come back east, that I couldn't really refuse. So I came back to Morgan Stanley, that was 95. In 2005, I wanted to make this note. Somebody once said to me, it takes a year to write a book, 5 years to write a good book, and 10 years to write a great book. On the strength of which, mine is really superb. because in 2005, I was now married for the third time, not necessarily more successfully than the first two. And I took a leave from Morgan Stanley to try to finish the book. Discovered that I had my own kind of traumatic injuries from Wall Street. I couldn't seem to write it. I wasn't happy. And I came back and said, okay, in an act of desperation, I'm going to go to Maine. I've got this 3-strand book, sailing, the family, the women. I'm going to cut the women out, and I'm going to go with 2 strands. And that's what I did. And then I edited it myself, because by then, having been in that internet discussion, I thought, why would you go into the publishing business if you could do it yourself? I mean, it seems pretty simple. You just, you do it yourself, and then the whole world finds out that you've done it. And they start to read it, which, as we know, it doesn't work that way. Anyway, I finally got it through the other side of the self-publishing, machine in 2010, and the rest is history. And now, what did I want to say besides that? Yes, make a space for it and it will appear. So in 2018, I sailed into Frenchboro Island in Maine with my youngest daughter, and I walked around the harbor, and I saw this house for sale, and I fell in love. And if you remember the last time you fell in love, it proposed a question, which is, okay, now what do you do? So I bought the house, and I've been living there since 2019, and I've been building a barn for the last 4 years, and now it's almost finished, and it's the most beautiful place to write or be. So I made a space, and I hope a sequel to Into My Father's Wake will appear.
And we're also going to get Eric to read his poem, The Barn, at the end of our session today. At the rate we're going, I don't know. I think what happened is what started out as the writers panel became the life experiences panel.
Which is fine.
Wait a minute, that's a little unfair, because I think if you were paying close attention, you would know that I did say, I just sat down with my notebooks and wrote.
Yes. Susie, you can get us back, of course. When did you first sit down to write a book? When did you get published?
I've been
What were
on
you thinking and so
a
forth?
nonfiction path, different from our colleagues here. But after I was a prosecutor, I went to a tech company and went to engineering school and became a lawyer and a cybersecurity engineer, and became active in the American Bar Association. So in 2011 or so, I became chair of the Science and Technology Law section and met a whole array of the smartest experts and lawyers that I could imagine. So after my chair year in 2010, that was a big year for data breaches. They were happening to huge companies. Massive amounts of personal data was being stolen. So I decided to write about data breaches. So my book in 2010 is called Data Breach and Encryption Handbook. And I wrote several of the chapters myself, but I also have about 25 authors that I collaborated with. So it took us 2 years to write this book. And I worked with an enterprise architect to try to illustrate for people what's a data breach. So we actually came up with visuals. And I looked at it sort of like being a lawyer in a jury trial. How do we teach the jury about a complex subject? So my technology career developed at a tech company. And my next book for the ABA was called, it was about the Internet of Things. And my most recent book is this artificial intelligence. And I know I'm not talking about artificial intelligence, but just to mention, it's called Legal Issues, Policy, and Practical Strategies. And it was published in 2024, and it took us a year. We have 40 authors, and I have 2 co-editors. And it just covers the whole broad array of AI issues. And I love teaching technical subjects to lay audience. I was also chair of the AI task force for the American Bar Association, and we wrote 2 reports covering the waterfront of AI issues. So this book is now one of the top 5 American Bar Association books. So I do a lot of research, and it's a great way to keep up because things are changing in the technology arena at lightning speed. So I love delving into all the issues, and I track all the data breaches. And I do presentations to RSA conference and others. So the whole point of this was to try to get the word out, help people understand what the issues are, and continue to think about how the future is going to unfold in this very complex area.
That's good. Al made me promise that I wasn't going to let this get drifting off into AI, which is good because I actually asked Claude, my little AI bot, to write a sonnet. I gave the input, and a sonnet. In 1 second, Claude wrote a sonnet called The Writer's Panel. It's really quite funny. And Al and I shared it, and we looked at it, and it was done in 1 second. And then I pointed out to Claude, that the word 12 and shelf didn't rhyme all that well, and you should think of 12. And he came back and said, yes, you're absolutely right. But I'm not going to inflict this sonnet on you.
So accommodating.
Ray,
Yes, sir.
take it away. Actually, when you say that to Ray, you're pretty sure you will.
I've written a couple of thrillers, wrote them over 20 years, 10 years as in Eric's direction there, produced a great book. But I want to take it back to the beginning. The person who really inspired me to be a writer in the first place was my mother. I was 11 years old. She was a professor at a local community college. One day she came up to me and she said, "Ray, what are you reading?" And I said, "Well, I'm reading 2 boys' sports books, Backboard Fever and Rambling Halfpack." She said, "Son, you got to broaden your horizon." So she goes to her bookshelf, which was vast, and she gives me The Deerslayer by James Fenimore Cooper. And that just opened my eyes to adventure, to writing about adventurers. And I read the entire canon of James Fenimore Cooper, and that changed my life. And it gave me the notion I can write that kind of adventure book as well. And then the next writer she introduced me to was Ernest Hemingway. And I read his entire canon, including The Sun Also Rises. And that was in college. And after college, I went straight to Paris. I had $500 to live on, and I wanted to make it last as long as possible. So I lived in a tent by the Seine. And that summer, I hitchhiked down to Pamplona and ran with the bulls. And that, running with the bulls during the 8 days of running, inspired my first book about a young man who has big adventures. He travels all over Europe and runs with the bulls and has other adventures. And so I kept a diary the whole time, and I basically covered the diary and I wrote this grand thriller about a young man who has these great adventures. And I finished it. I wrote a long that. And it's about 6 months later, I read it. It was just dreadful. So, forget about that. And then I got the notion to write thrillers. And part influenced by Ian Fleming, and part influenced by other writers, including Dan Jenkins, who wrote sports books. And I wrote over the course of 20 years 2 thrillers, one a hockey thriller. I'll just give you titles. It's Ned Kelly's Hat Tricks. A Harvard hockey star battles a mob kingpin. And then, so I finished that, and I to say I wrote that is an exaggeration, because the truth is I dictated. I mean, I was a lousy typist. I just couldn't type for anything. And I discovered this wonderful device, Dragon Naturally Speaking, and click it on, and you dictate. And 10 years later, you got hundreds of pages. But I gave this first novel to a buddy of mine who's an agent, and he says, "Who the hell do you think you are, Dan Jenkins?" No, okay. So then I wrote the sequel about the character 10 years later, who becomes an English professor. In the meantime, I become an English professor. And that's Ned Kelly's Bloodlust. An English professor battles a vampire. And that's the one I finished. I shared with Rick, and I shared it with a couple of agents, and I'm hoping that I can finally get it.
If we have enough time, we're going to talk about publishing too.
You
So, a whole different world. Can we go to Michael? You have some more, Ray?
I'm old.
Okay, Michael, I do want you to talk about your diaries, but I think it's only fair to let you just give a little bit of a rundown of everything else you've done there, because you've been obviously extremely productive, apart from the diary, or I should say, since the diaries.
I think the diary is the important one. The academic writing, you have to publish or perish, and I've perished while I've published. But
Be sure you speak loud enough so everybody can hear you.
basically, I do want to shout out when I hear Jack going through his old letters and getting stimulus. The diary, the letters are really valuable material to find out how much we've changed. And we're really lucky to have Andover, which has an archive project. Paige Roberts is in charge of it, and she's been very encouraging, not just to me, but to a guy in class of 64 who also wrote a diary. And she is encouraging people to send in the letters. She has files 250 years of people who have been diarists, who have turned in their letters sometimes, and all of you should do that. Talk to her. If you find letters, really go to her and share those. She wants it. There are very few of us who do that in the 20th century. She has very little, and it's going to be a lot less with the younger generation who are on the computers. So the thing is that there's actually a real need for Andover to have that history to find out what it was. And we have a particular value because we were one of the last non-co-ed classes that knew how insane this place could be. So I think that's important also as part of the record, because I went to 3 summer sessions, and I've got the diaries from those 3 summer sessions over there. And I saw what this place could be co-ed. I saw the professors who were learning to teach co-ed and who were part of the change that really brought about our movement away from the male-only denomination. So we were actually at a very important historic point. What we saw was the transition. As Benedict was going out and the others, my diary has what happened with Benedict, the confrontation I had with him. And some of the other kinds of things, I was part of a conference they had amongst the alumni to talk about going co-ed, 10 years before we actually did it. So go to the archive. If you've got stuff, definitely give it to Paige. Make it available. You don't have to make it available, I know. There's all sorts of stuff in there that you don't want to see. Tell her 20 years from now.
Yeah, but tell us about these diaries. Tell us about what you wrote. How?
Okay.
I mean, when did you do it? Did you do it at the end of every day? How did you go about it? How did you decide to do it? How did you keep other people from reading them? What was going on?
My father read to me from Pepys' diaries about the London fire when I was in the 6th grade. So I'm 12 years old. I really loved it. And Dad's challenged me, well, I haven't been able to write a diary, but you should start. Okay, Dad. So basically what happens is you get a kid started. I mean, we just heard at 11 years old, you get started, you start writing. It becomes a lifetime thing, and you have diarrhea of the pen. Writing your diaries. I mean, you just write. And a little kid writes pretty much garbage. But the thing is, he's writing, and that's what happened with me. So rather than me ever facing the blank canvas and not knowing what to say, I had way too much to say, and when I didn't write, I had this terrible guilt about not writing. I mean, I dreamed about this entity, my diary, which is hovering over me. So once you've gotten to have writing, you have no problem really writing. There's nothing that gets in the way of that. You just have to learn how to stop. Now, the basic thing, though, that the diary transitions, and being here at Andover, with all the homework and everything like that. So there were 3-week periods, and I just note in the calendar what had happened, and then I was going back. Pretty soon you're learning to remember a month back, and you're learning to forget the things that aren't essential. So many people don't like writing diaries because the garbage that they write is boring. All the things of the day, and they miss the things that are really important. It's only in retrospect that you suddenly see stories developing and you learn how to follow those stories. The problem is, and I really envy most of the people on this panel, once you learn to say, well, what's real? You cut off all of your creativity for being able to do fiction. I mean, you just really don't think that way. You're thinking in a totally different way of trying to find out what is happening. And that is more like a reporter than anything else. But with a diary, you're actually feeling out the world and who's around you, and you're writing stories, narratives. It takes 2 weeks, maybe a month, for these stories to develop. So through time, I've seen a real change in how I've been writing. My most important experience in diary writing was not my diary. My wife got lung cancer in 1987, and for 7 years in the process she died. But she discovered diary writing, and she talked to me about it, and that was one of the most useful things for her. She learned to write what she was feeling. She then asked me to read it. I said, okay, you can read my diary. And so we were reading each other's diary, but then we were writing for each other. When she died, there was another diary she'd been writing, the real one. And it was just something to read back, the final statement, But, so diaries are incredibly powerful.
Wait a minute, there's the book right there.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to read
Me too.
those.
I tried. 55 years afterwards, I told Ray, hey, I got a diary that I used to write. I hadn't read it for 55 years. And okay, now I'm going to transcribe it. And I started reading it. I started writing that transcription. Holy God. sometimes I just had to get up and go out on the deck and sit the rest of the afternoon. Is that who I was? Is that who I still am? Have I really changed that much? You know? And you start asking those questions, and you're like Rip Van Winkle to your own life. And so it's a very powerful thing. It can disavow you. But so my 55th reunion, I came and I listened to Jack for 2 hours disavow himself in front of a bunch of us. Al, you were there. You saw what Jack did. And God, I said, how can this guy write anything? No, I mean, really, Jack, that's what I thought. And then you did. I said, oh, I'm worried about myself and my little Jack, you were a model, and I wouldn't have gotten this thing transcribed if it hadn't been for you. So I did it, but then I realized, oh my God, I've got 50 names in here. I was a CIA agent while I was my senior prep, in fact, exploring everybody's soul, and writing. By then I could write stories about people. So if I mention anybody, I've got to send it to them. So people, grudgingly allowed me, except for maybe 4 or 5, to write what I wrote about them. And then, some interesting things started happening, which is my brother had gotten kicked out of Andover, and so I was interested in that particular story. Some of the people who got kicked out in our class, I went back to them. And so my diary includes their stories now. So I have the follow-up stories to a couple of people. Yeah, let me tell you, diaries are like animals. They reproduce. They go through stages. They become a way of looking at the world. They become a monster in your dreams. So there's a lot to it. But you're really writing very differently than most of what panel here is talking about. That's pretty much what I had to say.
Sort of what you've just been through reminds me of this wonderful short story by Saki called Tobermory. You probably know about Tobermory. Tobermory is the cat who shows up who's in the country house in the English countryside and knows how to talk. And Tobermory comes in while the house party is going on and impresses people initially, but somebody offends Tobermory. And so Tobermory then begins revealing who was in whose bedroom the night before. and pretty soon, the next day, Tobermory's nowhere to be found. So when Mike first showed me the diary, of course, the first thing I went through was to make sure there was nothing in there about me. and I was glad the only thing in there was something that John Short said, which was terribly unkind and was also wrong, because you can't do anything with John Short about it today, right? It's way too late. But anyway, we're going to send you the link. You're going to see Michael's diaries, and it's something that's worth thinking about. So, okay, so
can I do that?
Yeah, please go ahead. I want you guys talking.
There's a reference that Jack made to Dalton McBee, who was my teacher, I think, in the 10th grade. And one of his writing techniques was to get you to emulate somebody's prose. So you had to come in and pick a passage, and let's say it was, character description. So you had to go find in some famous novel or book we were studying, a paragraph of character description. And then you had to pick your own character and you had to describe the character just the way that person, that author would have described the character, which was incredibly instructive to actually see, oh, that's how it's being done, word for word. You discovered, oh, there's meter there, or there's internal rhyme, or there's, imagery, or, whatever. So that was one thing he did. And then because of that, I ended up writing a story about this old couple who lived down the road from our family house. He was the chairman of the speech and drama department at NYU, and she was the executive secretary of the editor of Harper's Bazaar. And who the hell knows why, they came up to Dunstable, Massachusetts, this little, milk town, and hung out in the woods in the summer. And we became their surrogate children because they didn't have children. And they were both alcoholics. And I was about 11 or so, and I was like their youngest of these two amazing drunks. And I wrote a story about them, and Dalton put it in a book that he wrote about teaching writing. So my story about the Silers appeared in this book, and when I saw it, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I had written something that was in a book, you know, in Dalton's book. And I know that really like affected me as, oh, this is a real thing, you know. So I'm deeply grateful to Thor.
There is something magical about when you get the thing between two covers. There's just, I don't know what it is, but there's, maybe it's been in our brains ever since thousands of years ago, but getting it between covers is really something. So process though, Al and I were talking about process for writing. This applies primarily to fiction, because for nonfiction you're supposed to be telling the truth. But for fiction you have to find the truth somehow. And essentially, writers of fiction get divided into two categories. One are called plotters. Plotters are the people who plot the whole thing out from the beginning, and then they go write the plot. And the others are called pantsers, because they're doing it by the seat of their pants. They sit down and start writing, and they take it where it goes. Al's got kind of an intermediate version of this, which I had not previously heard about the process of fiction. So maybe Al, you could talk about that. And,
Well, you know, it's
we
funny.
can get some other people talk about the process they follow.
I can be brief. I go into more detail in the clip that I have in our video, in terms of the way the way that I was trained. But Mike, what you said about a kid writing a diary will write all this garbage, and then you think you're writing about one thing, and it isn't until later that you look back at it and you see what's there. And that was the process that I was taught. And you can't do this with genre fiction. You really need to be a plotter. You need to know where you're going. But, you know, I was taught to know my characters, know their situation, and then let them tell me where they wanted to go. But the thing was, you would do an entire draft, and then you would do like just exactly what you said, Mike. You would go back and you try to say, well, what's the real thing going on under this that wants to come out? And once you could identify that, then you threw the entire first draft out and started all over again with that thing that your unconscious was trying to push through your conscious mind that knew what you were all about when you were doing the first draft. So that very quickly is what that was about.
So I was going to ask Bill. Bill's done a lot of, obviously, NPR journalism and books and nonfiction books, but as I tell you, I'm very struck by his two novels. And I wondered whether you have the experience, Bill, of knowing where you wanted to end with the novel before you knew how you were going to get there. Did you have an ending and then you worked toward the ending? How did you, do you recall how you went about those? Well, Bird Mercy's quite recent, so you probably recall that very well. But what about Prospect?
I'll tell you a story about Prospect.
Okay.
I wrote it exclusively Christmas vacations and summers because I was too busy teaching when school was in session at the time. So Christmas vacation and summer, I would go out to my office at Curry for as long as it took me to write 2.5, 3 pages. And then I would stop because I was always afraid that if I went any further on a given day, I would miss opportunities. I would forget to say what the weather was like or what somebody had thought about something that happened 10 pages earlier. I'd go too fast. I'd get to the end too quickly. And so that was my process. 2.5 pages, 2.5 to 3 pages a day. And one day I was sitting at my desk. I suddenly knew what the last page was going to look like. I knew exactly what the last page was going to look like. And I was terrified because I wasn't anywhere near the last page. And I knew it. And so I stopped and I got up. It was a beautiful summer day, and I got up and I walked all around the campus several times to stop myself from writing. But then the next day I went back and wrote 2.5 pages. But I knew what the ending, I knew exactly what the ending was. I knew the last thing that somebody was going to say in the book. And I hadn't known for 2+ years before that. And so I don't know what anybody else's process is, and I don't know how accurate it is to separate people into those who plot and those who do it by the seat of the pants. I have no idea, and nothing that I say about writing may be even remotely pertinent to anybody else's experience.
I'm
So
gonna
that's
ask,
the story.
I'm gonna ask Eric in a moment, but I wanna go off that about Prospect for a moment. I don't know how many other people read Prospect, but Bill and I talked about the fact that today, first of all, it's an incredibly affecting novel. And secondly, I think we've agreed you couldn't get it published today because it would be considered to be politically incorrect. There's racial aspects to it that, to me, are extremely realistic for the time in which it was written and would have been considered fully appropriate at the time it was written, but now you have trouble with it. Rick Allen, who's not here, but his most recent book called Reckoning with Race, extremely brave thing by Rick to have written his own personal memoir of dealing with race coming down from the north and going to Atlanta and becoming a journalist there. And it's a very, very brave book. And his publisher sent it out to what's now called a sensitivity reader, who was a young black woman about 25 years old. And she wrote back, "This guy's a racist." And Rick's wife said, "You can't publish it. You cannot take the risk of a book reviewer saying that you're a racist." And a lot of us had to work with him and with her and say, "No, come on, this book is really worth publishing," and indeed it was really worth publishing. But it was this kind of sensitivity is an issue in publishing. And if you haven't read Prospect, Bill, I don't think I'm harming anything to say this may be one of the last generations where you could read it and not worry about that yourself. So I'm not selling the book. I'm just saying it's
I
got
wish you would. It doesn't make any difference now. The only place you find it's the remainder bin.
No, that's not true. You can get it on Amazon. You can get anybody these books on Amazon. Eric, Mike's thing made me wonder. I mean, here you're sailing from San Francisco to Hawaii and back, presumably busy part of the time. Are you keeping a journal?
Yeah.
How did you? Did you write your book from the journals?
Yeah, well,
Were you
in
thinking
terms
about
of-
women when you were driving? When you were?
Well, no, I mean, first of all, the boat, under a lot of conditions, the boat's sailing itself. And there's 24 hours.
Yeah.
And you have to cook, you have to eat, you have to sleep, and you have to manage the sails, but mostly the sails are managing themselves. I read 17 books out and back.
Oh my goodness.
I read the whole Patrick O'Brien series.
Oh my goodness.
And, and I would, like, one of my favorite examples is among the women I married was a woman who had an art gallery in New York. And she had this really great young painter, a woman who had sailed across the English Channel and done a big painting, which was chalk and charcoal on brown paper panels. And when you looked at, when I looked at it, I thought, oh, she's been in the ocean. Why? Because when you looked at it, you realized, oh, she's captured kind of the sea in a high mood, but, oh, look, there's a guy running across the waves right there. And right there, there's a horse's head. And right there, there's somebody who is, what are they doing exactly? And I thought, that's exactly how it is, because the pattern recognition instantaneous in your mind, when the spume flies up, if light goes through it and it takes on exactly the shape, let's say, of a bowl, you see the bowl. And you see the bowl move, and then the bowl is gone, just like that. So when I was sailing, I would just write down whatever I saw, or whatever was happening. And one thing that happened was I got to Hawaii after 25 days. I made a really big mistake navigating, and I went back offshore. And now I sailed back, and I sailed back, and I sailed back. And the third day I sailed back, I realized I'm looking at the same fucking building right in front of me. So I've actually made no progress whatsoever. And I gotta go to Lanai. I can't get into Hilo. I gotta go to Lanai. So I turned to go down to Lanai, and now I'm terrified looking off to my left. I realize, oh, that's the edge of the universe right there. Like, if you get downwind of Hawaii, you're fucked. You can't sail back up against the trades to get back. So I was really scared. So I stayed awake, and I finally got into Lanai. But right before I got into Lanai, there was a presence in the boat that was as palpable as Jack sitting next to me. It was in the cockpit when I was down below, and it was down below when I was in the cockpit, and it cared about me, and it was aware of me, and I was aware of it. So when I wrote this story for the Examiner, which had to be 75 inches long, my editor called me and said, what is this shit about presence? What is that? He said, I'm gonna cut that because it makes you sound like a lunatic. And because it was a union paper, I could say, fuck you. If you take it out, take my byline off. I go, no, okay. So it got left in. But I was sitting there saying, no, I know this is true. It happened, and maybe it was sleep deprivation, but if you read other sailors, a lot of solo sailing books you can read, many report versions of this, So basically, I just wrote down whatever happened, and then later I wrote it down.
It's probably hard to tie yourself to the mast if you're the only guy on the boat. We want to have a chance for our poets to read a couple of poems. I know Eric is going to read one, but Al, are you going to start us off? Or have you changed your mind now?
No, I haven't changed my mind, but I have 3 candidates, and if I can do more than one, if I can do 2,
You could do more than one.
okay. In that case, then I know what I'm
There'll
doing.
be some bad repercussions, but you can do more than one. No, go ahead, Al.
No, I'd be very happy to.
Okay.
So if we go around, and then you come back.
That's all right. We're going to get some, we might have time for some questions, if there are.
Sure.
If there's no more questions after one, you're going to read more poems.
Well, Rick, I'll just say one thing while Al's getting himself together. When you're talking about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, and fiction you can write pretty much what you want, but nonfiction you got to be a little bit more careful. And when I finished writing Loon, I didn't know whether it was fitting. I tried the best to make it obviously a real account. And increasingly, we were talking about this earlier. I went from 110 letters down to maybe 3 lines from one letter, and I kept fighting with my editor at the end. And I'd say, I really want this to be pure. I want this to be my 19-year-old voice. I want it to sound like I did then, like you were talking, Mike. And then having this, and she'd say, no, they want to hear your 51-year-old voice. They don't want to hear your 19-year-old voice. And it was a hard, sort of conflict. And she was right, and the book was better for it. The other thing, just quickly about a nonfiction book, is that the last person I spoke to after the book was finished, it was in the hands of Random House and ready to go, designed and covered, and it was all pretty heavy shit. And I got a call one day from an attorney in Newton Center, Massachusetts, and I'm down in bumfuck Outer Banks, and she said that she's the libel attorney for Random House. And she said, I just have 3 questions. Nice book, good job. I have 3 questions. Number 1, and here you talk about your friend Dan Burton, and you say that he was a pot-smoking California surfer. And I said, yeah, pretty much. She said, well, do you think that his progeny or his heirs or this or that, or they would ever object to the fact that you called him that? I said, shit, I don't know, I never thought about it, but my instinct is he probably wears a badge of honor. But hang on. So I write Dan and said, you're telling me I'm going to be in the Library of Congress? And he was, I don't know if you guys have seen it, he was dude. I mean, he's down in Cabo on the beach now. And he's, so the second one said, you got a guy here named Rodriguez, and Rodriguez is coming back from R&R. He's going to 30 days afterwards, which was the time limit to get clapped. And he's getting a penicillin shot from the corpsman, and you describe him as walking back from the corpsman's tent with his fist in the air and pulling up his pants with the other hand, and like in victory, I am a man. I got laid in R&R now. Everybody knows it because I got clapped. And this is all the sense that God gave 19-year-old boys. And I said, not his real name. It's the only name I changed. Okay. The third thing, you have, you're depicted here with Steve, your friend Steve, about the 2 of you robbing a liquor store in Los Angeles one night. And I said, yeah. And she said, I'm not sure that you used his last name. And I thought, holy shit, man, this is serious stuff. Just take it out. It's not, just take it out. While she's now, we're talking back and forth. I'm Googling Steve Vion. Hadn't thought about for 50 years. Bam, there he is. And he gets in, he's there because that weekend we'd gone with his family in Bakersfield, and then we'd gone to Los Angeles, and this other stuff happened. And he was in he got picked up because his father was sort of a prominent guy in Bakersfield, and Steve had given a eulogy at his funeral several weeks before. So ever since, I've had visions of Steve at my door, at 3 in the morning, along with Sergeant Hilton, who some of you may remember. And, but I said, I don't think you used your last name, so I did a quick search of the document, and I had, I said, let's call him Bernie then. He doesn't have to be Steve, it could be anything. He said, no, his name was Steve, you can do that, that's legal. You just can't use his last name. So that was what you go through with the hurdles that fiction writers don't have to go over.
All right,
I have a
poetry.
similar story for you.
Al, you want to stand while you?
I do understand, but I want to preface this. How many of us came here in the fall of 1962, 9th grade? Fall of what?
I'm joking.
We have a wag in the back of the room who looks about 12. Okay, those of us who were here for the first week in the 9th grade, the first day we had hazing, senior hazing. Now, if you came as a lower, you missed senior hazing.
Oh, you did.
Oh, you did?
You still had it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, then you can all resonate. Yeah, all friends. This is my story of my first day. And by the way, it's a fun narrative, but it actually went a long way towards creating an identity that I saw myself as, that's carried me through literally for the rest of my life. It's called How I Made a Name for Myself. It is a dozen seconds since the race has started. I look to my left, then right, and at last. The grass against my face is cool and thick as I retrain my sight and put the peanut up against my nose and push and scramble on my hands and knees to move it inch by inch to try to close the gap between me and the rest. With ease, it seems, they make their way across the green, enclosed by dorms and classroom buildings out front of the commons. We are overseen by seniors, exercising all the clout afforded them to lord it over us on this, the day reserved for new boy hazing. They behave as gods for a day must, and turn a smug and haughty eye while gazing at our struggles. No one tells us what the penalty would be for losing. Though the loser of the backwards race, the butt of much derision, earned a nickname so clever that it marked all his relations for the next 8 years through college. I am not keen to try their inspiration, but I am losing badly. So, goodbye caution, and I pop the peanut in my mouth, bend up my head and purse, and spit it forward. Scurry up to it, begin again, launch and repeat. Whether legit or not, I finish third. The Lord's conferred. I didn't push the peanut all the way, says one, to whom the others could defer. But then another speaks up. Low prep may not have done it strictly by the book, but he was certainly creative, and we respect that. I'm off the hook. I know my name now in this unknown land. So some of you will know the people referenced here. So the loser of the package race, of course, was James Otis Ross.
And the hazer was George Bush.
Wasn't?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that's who it was.
Oh, well, I learned something today. I didn't know that. So, but yeah, that was the peanut race, and I was in a place that actually respected creativity, and that's interesting. That's right. Yeah.
Will you read us the part?
Yeah, sure.
You're going to have to stand also.
Oh, okay. I just say that at one of my children's urgings, she had taken a writing group with 3 women who live in Spain, make money by running writing groups for people who live somewhere else. And I found it to be tremendously interesting and fun. And the best thing about it is, if you came to Andover, you were taught to perform So if there's somebody telling you you have to write to this prompt, you write to the prompt. And it can be very helpful. So this was a prompt that I was given to me about, write a poem about a place that was lost to me. Anyway,
There you go.
that old barn, it was the old 3-tiered New England barn, ground floor for cows on the bottom, with milk machines and conduit pipes attached along the outer walls, and urine troughs in between, parallel like wide trolley tracks. Second floor haylofts on both sides to leave open space and air down the middle, as the summer mix of methane, heat, and dust was all too combustible, if not spontaneously in the stacked hay itself, then in danger of sparks. And the third level loft hung high in the middle on its own under the peak, as did a heavy rope descending from those top rafters, come to replace all that bovine activity that had been there before the three of us arrived. We hung there and swung there, conducted snowball wars between the upper floors, or brought friends to play sardines among the stacks of antique lumber my father couldn't bear to throw away. And one winter day in that capacious space, my older brother, with a sudden swift movement of his gifted throwing arm, released a short length of lath upwards toward a single swooping barn swallow, who met that piece in full flight and crumpled down dead on the floor between my sister and me, stopping our hearts for that final moment that was that small bird's last. Lately I've been asked, why am I building a barn on this small island in the form and period of that original construct from my childhood, now well more than a half century in the mirror? And my answer is, because.
Those of you who are not on Bill's list, Bill writes some very nice political.
Well, if you want a political one.
No, we don't anymore.
I've written about 40 of those, but
You're gonna stay up.
they're long. And this is short. And this is from a book
Will you stand?
that I did, yes, called Who Taught That Mouse to Write? And if you have grandchildren who are young enough, or great-grandchildren, whatever it is, you might have some fun with it. So this is I don't write poetry, I write doggerel. Doggerel is stuff that rhymes. That's it.
Not only though.
That's it. It bounces and it rhymes. And it should not be mistaken for poetry. Fran Klein writes poetry. This one's called Termites. Wood's good for building, who wouldn't agree? It's hard and it lasts and it comes from a tree. You saw it and nail it. When it's complete, the building it's built is most certainly neat. Oh, who would doubt wood is a choice you should make when building a building to last, for Pete's sake? There's hardly a reason wood wouldn't endure. At night, termites giggle and nod and say, sure.
Question. There's either a question or there's Al reading another poem. Anyone have a question, Al? Okay, Al.
I have a question.
Okay.
So those of us who don't write, but would like to write, what would be your advice? How do you start?
That's how
What kind of writing?
you start.
That's how.
You start. You start.
Anywhere.
You start.
Not
Start.
at the beginning.
You just start.
No,
You just start.
Don't use your judging mind, just write. That's the, people get stopped up because they're judging what they're doing while they're doing it. That's like trying to think and hit at the same time.
Think of Bill having come up halfway through the book with the last page and what he went through, and you just got to go out and beat yourself up and forget it for a minute,
Just have fun.
and then just keep going, or else you'll
Marty has
But also,
Marty.
write books in different genres. Read a lot of Shakespeare, read great books, read the great novelists. That will inspire you. You know, I started again because I read James Fenimore Cooper, Hawkeye, and that whole group. That will inspire you. I want to write like that. Right.
I think you need to know what it is you want to say. You have to have a starting point.
where you wanna go.
And then you elaborate.
It's all too serious, man. If you want to write, sit down and write. Don't worry about it. Right? If you've heard two people talk and you like the way they talk, right? Did you ever read George V. Higgins?
Yes, indeed.
The Friends of Eddie Coyle?
Yes.
Yeah.
The great first line of all novels. Jackie Brown with no expression on Jackie Brown, 26 years old, with no expression on his face, said he could get some guns. You can't stop reading.
Also, if you think about speech, you use it when there's someone you want to say something to. And sort of there's been suggestions or intimations about epistolary novels, you know. And I would say, write a letter to somebody that you want to say something to them. Write a letter to somebody who's dead, or somebody lost, or somebody, if they only knew this is what you felt, because that's in you. You just need to give it an avenue to come out.
Going with what Eric's saying, what I would say is, go to your archived emails if you have no way anywhere else.
Yeah.
Find a letter you wrote to your boss who you told to go to hell when you got off the job, and let me tell you, you'll have a starting point. You'll have a voice. And let me tell you, follow that, and it's a sure way to write.
Marty's got something.
My impression is, Michael, you must have written longhand while back in the day.
Yes.
And Eric, perhaps on your sailboat. Did the others, you all use computers, or did anyone write longhand?
First, I still write like
Longhand.
Computer, legal pads, pencil and legal pads.
Typewriter in my case.
Typewriter?
Yeah, in the first book, it was really tough because if you had something you wanted to change, I couldn't just scratch it through. I had to start a whole new piece of paper, and it took forever. Yeah, that was back before we got.
Again, I dictate, and that
Oh, that's right.
lends itself great to dialogue. Right.
I want to reinforce the idea of just writing, because, which is what I did with Loons. I had no intent of it being a book, and was quite surprised when I went to New York, having not been there for many years, and presented this talked to the agent about it. She said, "You're talking about a book." And I looked around the office, having never been in a publishing office before, and everybody was like 12, you know, and all these pretty people walking around, very hip and piercing and stuff. And I went back, having not left off the transcript or the manuscript, I went back on the plane shuttle back down to Washington and processed what I had seen. And I said, what I have to do, and this thing can't start out with some, like a battle, nobody wants it. She had told me in as many words that nobody gave a shit about Vietnam, and nobody's going to buy it. But I thought about being in New York and what might get the attention of the people that were there, because they were the ones that were going to read it. Not the agent, but that would be a 21-year-old, 22-year-old. So I thought about it. I was a big fan of Lou Reed at the time. And he had written a song with John Cale about Valerie Solanas. And started out, Valerie Solanas went to the elevator, she took it to the 4th floor. She pointed the gun at Andy, said, you're not going to hurt me anymore. There's got to be some retribution. There's got to be this. And I don't care if you're alive anymore. We don't care if she's alive anymore. That's what Lou Reed and John Cale are saying. And I thought that was really cool because, and it just, bam. And I said, I'm going to talk about what happened on that. It happened on June 6, 1968. And then I thought, well, Columbia graduation happened on June 6, 1968. And all the seniors walked out. That was something. Bobby Kennedy was shot on June 6, 1968. That was something. So here are these three events that were all, so what I realize I'm saying is that, oh yeah, you think there's violence going on over here? You guys should see what's going on where you live, back home. I mean, Valerie Solanas was shooting Andy Warhol. Columbia graduation seniors were all walking out, and obviously Bobby Kennedy was shot. And I wrote it on the plane going back to Washington in an hour. And I didn't change the words exactly what it just came out, and but it was nothing I could have thought of, and it made just an enormous difference to the book because it was the beginning. So I could have sat there for months and months and months saying, how am I going to start this? How am I going to start this? I can't get the first paragraph. Just write, you know, and you'll just be so amazed at what just the flows.
Can
You have to enjoy writing. You have to enjoy writing.
Right.
Well, you have to enjoy what you're writing about.
Well, I think when it's happening, it's not hard, and Jack is talking about something that I think most writers, creative people can relate to, which is that there is a zone or a mood or something that can happen that you drop into, which I hear Jack describing there. He dropped into something that was like a realization, a knowing, a certainty, and he let it out. And I've learned that I don't know when that's going to happen to me, but I know that when I feel it happening, I have to let it out. I can't say, no, I'm going to go to the store and get something. No. Just sit down and let it come out because it wants to come out now. And it's a mysterious thing that has something to do with who you are in that moment that you recognize and you allow.
Thank you. That's good.
There's another option, and that is write something that you think everybody needs to know about. And I spent a lot of time early on in my career working with a lot of British and Australian journalists. And apropos of nothing, but I had to tell it, they said the ultimate headline and the ultimate story that would just win everything, you know, capture everyone's attention. Teenage doctor priest in madcap sex change dash to palace. I throw that out there because I had to deliver an anecdote.
I think we're actually done, so